The wealthy residents always avoided the black teens swimming in their lake. But when the flood came and an elderly woman was drowning, everyone watched in horror as he dove into the raging waters. The water rippled against Jaden's dark skin as he cut through the lake's surface at dawn. His muscular arms pulled him forward in steady strokes, the cool morning air raising goosebumps on his shoulders whenever they broke the surface. The community lake stretched out before him, surrounded by a mix of weathered wooden houses and newly built mansions that reflected orange in the rising sun. His watch beeped, 6:30 a.m. Time for one more lap. Boy, hey boy, a sharp voice cut through the morning quiet. Jaden's rhythm faltered. He treaded water, turning toward the sound. A man in pressed golf clothes stood at the lake's edge, his face pinched with annoyance. "This is a private area," the man called out, gesturing at the section of lake behind one of the new mansions. "No, sir, it's not," Jaden replied, keeping his voice steady despite the familiar tightness in his chest. "The whole lake is public property." The man's jaw clenched. "Well, you're making the residents uncomfortable swimming this early. There are public pools in other neighborhoods." Jaden didn't respond. He'd had this conversation too many times in the 3 years since the new houses started going up. Instead, he dove under, letting the water muffle the man's continued protests. When he surfaced several yards away, the man had disappeared back into his mansion. The memory hit him then, as it always did. Marcus's laugh echoing across this same water, the splash fight they'd started, the sudden silence when his best friend went under and didn't come back up. Jaden's arms felt heavy, but he forced himself to keep swimming. He couldn't let the fear win. Not again. "Morning, Jaden," a familiar voice called out. Mrs. Rodriguez waved from her small dock, her gray hair wrapped in a faded bandana. She'd lived in her lakeside cottage for 40 years, long before the mansions arrived. "Don't let old Mr. Patterson bother you. His kind forgets this lake belonged to everyone long before their fancy houses showed up." Jaden swam to her dock, grabbing the edge. "Morning, Mrs. R. How's the garden?" "Oh, surviving." She glanced at the sky, frowning. "But this weather's got me worried. My joints are acting up something fierce. Storm's coming." As if on cue, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the lake. Jaden looked up at the gathering clouds, dark and heavy with rain. "Your grandfather used to say the same thing," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, her weathered face creasing with concern. "He could feel a storm coming days before it hit. Remember what he always told you about the floods? 'The water doesn't care how much money you have,'" Jaden quoted. "It'll take the poor folks first because we're down in the hollow, but the rich folks' fancy houses won't stop it either." His grandfather had passed 2 years ago, but his words felt especially relevant now. The new residents had fought against flood prevention measures, claiming they would disturb the lake's natural beauty. Meanwhile, the older parts of the neighborhood, where Jaden's family lived, still flooded every major storm. An electronic crackle cut through the air, followed by the community warning system. "Attention residents. The National Weather Service has issued a severe storm warning for Houston and surrounding areas. Expected rainfall of 10 to 15 inches over the next 24 hours. Please begin storm preparations immediately. Better head home," Mrs. Rodriguez said, patting Jaden's shoulder. "Your mama will be worried." Jaden pulled himself out of the water, grabbing his towel from the dock. His muscles burned pleasantly from the workout. 3 years of dawn swims had transformed his body from the lanky kid he'd been when Marcus died into something stronger, more capable. As he dried off, a sleek BMW pulled up to the mansion next door. Mrs. Thompson stepped out, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the humid morning air. Unlike her neighbors, she'd never bothered Jaden about swimming. Sometimes he caught her watching him from her window, her expression unreadable. Today, though, she looked troubled. She stood at her mailbox, staring at the darkening sky. "Mrs. Thompson?" Jaden called out. "Storm's coming in fast. You might want to move your car to higher ground." She startled, then gave him a distracted wave. "Oh yes, thank you, dear. I'll have Thomas take care of it when he arrives." "Thomas isn't coming today," Mrs. Rodriguez called over. "He called earlier. His neighborhood's already flooding. You should come stay with me until the storm passes." Mrs. Thompson shook her head. No, I'll be fine. The house is solid. Besides, I can't leave. I'm expecting an important package. Jaden exchanged worried looks with Mrs. Rodriguez. They both knew how quickly the lake could rise during a big storm. The wind picked up as Jaden walked home, whipping his damp towel against his legs. More thunder rumbled closer now. The older houses creaked and swayed, while the mansions loomed silent and stern behind their manicured lawns. His little brother Devin was already up when Jaden got home, eating cereal at their small kitchen table. "Mom says you're crazy for swimming with a storm coming," he announced through a mouthful of Cheerios. "Your brother's not crazy," their mother corrected, entering from the hall with an armload of flashlights and batteries. "He's dedicated. But today was the last swim for a while, right, Jaden?" "Yes, ma'am." Jaden grabbed a banana from the counter. "Need help with storm prep?" She nodded, handing him a flashlight. "Check all the windows in the back. Make sure they're sealed tight. Your father's picking up sandbags on his way home from his night shift." As Jaden moved through the house, he could hear their neighbors outside, calling to each other as they secured loose items and moved cars. The community meeting hall would be opening soon for those who needed shelter. Usually that meant the older residents from the original houses. The mansion owners never came. The first fat drops of rain hit the windows as Jaden finished his inspection. He paused at his bedroom window, looking out toward the lake. Through the growing gloom, he could just make out Mrs. Thompson's house. A single light burned in an upstairs window. His phone buzzed, a community alert, urgent, flash flood warning issued. Lake levels expected to rise rapidly. Immediate evacuation recommended for lakefront properties. Thunder cracked directly overhead, making the house shudder. Devin appeared in Jaden's doorway, eyes wide. "It's okay," Jaden assured him. "Just a storm. We've been through plenty." But as the rain intensified, drumming against the roof like thousands of impatient fingers, Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that this storm was different. He thought of Mrs. Thompson, alone in her big house, waiting for a package that wouldn't come. Of Marcus, and how quickly the lake could turn from friend to enemy. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the sound of something he'd hoped never to hear again. Screams, desperate and terrified, coming from the direction of the lake. The screams came again, closer this time. Jaden rushed to the window, pressing his face against the glass. Rain blurred his vision, but he could make out frantic movement near the lake's edge. "Mom!" he shouted, already running for the front door. "Something's wrong at the lake." His mother caught his arm in the hallway. "Jaden Williams, don't you dare step foot outside this house." "But someone's in trouble. The rescue teams are on their way." She gripped his shoulders, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Promise me you'll stay inside." Thunder shook the house before Jaden could answer. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. "Perfect," his mother muttered. She released Jaden and clicked on one of the flashlights. "Devin, where are you, baby?" "Here," Devin called from the kitchen. The beam of his own flashlight bounced off the walls as he joined them. "Is the power out everywhere?" Jaden moved to the front window. The entire street had gone dark. Rain hammered against the roof, so hard it sounded like gravel being poured. Through the deluge, he could see neighbors hurrying between houses, sharing flashlights and news. His father's truck pulled up, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Jaden and Devin ran out to help him with the sandbags, the rain instantly soaking through their clothes. "It's bad out there," their father said as they stacked bags against the front door. Water already pooled around their feet, deeper than usual for this early in a storm. "They're closing roads all over Houston. Lake's rising faster than I've ever seen." "Did you drive past Mrs. Thompson's?" Jaden asked. His father's expression darkened. "That fool woman's still there. Rescue squad tried to evacuate her, but she wouldn't budge. Says she's waiting for some package." More screaming cut through the storm, followed by the wail of sirens. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, reflecting off the sheets of rain. "Get back inside," their father ordered. "All of you, now." They huddled in the living room, listening to emergency alerts on their phones. The National Weather Service warned of unprecedented rainfall and catastrophic flooding. Devin curled up next to their mother on the couch, while their father paced, checking windows and doors. Jaden's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Lake's already at the bottom steps of my porch. Never seen it rise so fast." He texted back, "You safe?" "In the community center with others." Mrs. Thompson still won't leave. A crash from outside sent them all running to the front window. A massive oak branch had fallen across the street, taking power lines with it. Sparks flew despite the rain. "Back away from the windows," their father warned. Those lines could still be live. The water in the street was ankle-deep now, carrying debris from upstream. Jaden watched a child's bicycle float past, followed by trash cans and lawn furniture. His phone buzzed again. Another community alert. "Emergency. Dam release imminent. Expect rapid water level rise. All residents in flood-prone areas evacuate immediately." "We need to go," their father said. "Grab your emergency bags." 5 minutes. Devin started crying. "But what about my games? My computer?" "Lives matter more than things," their mother said firmly. "Go pack your medicines and important papers, right now." Jaden ran to his room, shoving clothes and his school laptop into his waterproof backpack. Through his window, he could see the lake had swollen to twice its normal size, waves crashing against the expensive docks of the Mansion District. A flash of movement caught his eye. Someone was standing on Mrs. Thompson's back porch, waving what looked like a flashlight. Even through the rain, he recognized her silver hair. "Dad," he shouted. "Mrs. Thompson's on her porch." His father joined him at the window, squinting through the darkness. "Damn stubborn woman. Rescue teams can't get boats in with the water this rough." The wind changed direction, carrying Mrs. Thompson's voice to them. "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help." Jaden's muscles tensed, remembering other cries for help 3 years ago. Remembering how he'd frozen then, watching helplessly as Marcus went under. "We have to do something," he said. "We have to get our family to safety," his father corrected. "The professionals will handle it." But as they loaded the car, Jaden could see no rescue vehicles anywhere near the lake. The fallen trees and rising water had cut off access from both directions. Their mother insisted on driving separately, in case they needed to rescue neighbors. As Jaden climbed into the passenger seat of her car, Devin safely buckled in the back. A new sound rose above the storm, the deep, resonant groan of stressed wood. Through the rain, they watched in horror as Mrs. Thompson's expensive dock began to break apart. The support beams snapped like twigs, sending sections of wood tumbling into the churning water. Mrs. Thompson's screams pierced the air as waves crashed over her porch. "Mom, stop the car." Jaden's hand was already on the door handle. "Jaden, no!" But he was already running, his feet splashing through flood water that reached his knees. The current tugged at his legs as he fought his way toward the lake. Behind him, he heard his mother's voice, nearly lost in the storm. "James! James, he's going in!" The water rose with every step. By the time Jaden reached the lake's normal shoreline, it was waist-deep and rising. Debris battered his legs, branches, toys, pieces of dock. Mrs. Thompson had climbed onto her porch railing as waves crashed around her. Her normally perfect hair plastered against her face, her expensive clothes soaked through. "Hold on," Jaden shouted. "I'm coming." She turned toward his voice, relief flooding her face. Then a massive wave slammed into the porch. The railing gave way with a crack like a gunshot. Mrs. Thompson's scream cut off as she vanished beneath the dark water. Without hesitation, Jaden dove in. The lake water hit Jaden like a punch to the chest. Cold and dark, it churned around him as he forced his eyes open against the murk. Debris floated past, pieces of wood, plastic chairs, a garden hose that nearly tangled his legs. He spotted Mrs. Thompson's pale blue blouse in the darkness, her silver hair swirling like a halo around her head. She thrashed weakly, sinking faster than he expected. Training kicked in. The countless hours he'd spent studying rescue techniques on YouTube after Marcus died, practicing moves in the calm morning water. Jaden's lungs burned as he pushed deeper. His fingers brushed fabric, then lost it. He kicked harder, fighting the current that tried to sweep them both away. This time, he grabbed her blouse firmly and pulled her toward him. Mrs. Thompson's eyes flew open. Panic flashed across her face. Her arms windmilled, one hand catching Jaden's shoulder with surprising strength. "Stop fighting!" He tried to shout, but only bubbles emerged. She was going to drown them both if he couldn't calm her down. Something solid slammed into Jaden's back, a piece of her destroyed dock. The impact knocked what little air he had from his lungs. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. Not like this. Not again. He wrapped one arm around Mrs. Thompson's waist and kicked hard for the surface. Her struggles weakened as the lack of oxygen took its toll. Just a few more feet. They broke through together, gasping. Rain pelted their faces as waves tried to push them back under. Mrs. Thompson coughed violently, clinging to Jaden's shoulders. "I've got you," he managed between breaths. "Just stay calm. Can't swim," she choked out. "I know. I'll do the swimming. Just hold on and try to float." A familiar voice cut through the storm. "Jaden, baby, come back." His mother stood at the water's edge, held back by his father. Devin pressed against her side, face streaked with tears. Other neighbors had gathered too, their flashlight beams cutting through the rain. Jaden tried to angle them toward shore, but the current was stronger than anything he'd trained for. It dragged them parallel to the bank instead, past Mrs. Thompson's house, past Mrs. Rodriguez's empty cottage. "There's a boat coming," someone shouted. "Hold on." But Jaden could barely hear them over the rush of water and his own pounding heart. Every stroke felt like moving through cement. Mrs. Thompson's weight dragged at him as she slipped in and out of consciousness. A massive wave rose behind them. Jaden barely had time to tighten his grip before it crashed over their heads, driving them under. His shoulders slammed into something hard, a submerged tree branch. Pain shot down his arm. They surfaced again, but now Mrs. Thompson's head lolled against his shoulder. She wasn't moving. "Mrs. Thompson." Jaden shook her as best he could while treading water. "Wake up. I need you to help me." Her eyes fluttered. "So tired?" "No. Tell me about the package you're waiting for. What's so important?" Another wave hit, but this time Jaden was ready. He rolled with it, keeping their heads above water. "My husband's watch," Mrs. Thompson mumbled. "Charles left it to me. Being resized." "Keep talking." Jaden kicked harder, trying to angle them toward a partially submerged fence. If he could just get them something to hold on to. 40 years. Never took it off? Her voice strengthened slightly. "Stupid. Shouldn't have waited." "Not stupid. Sentimental." His fingers brushed metal, the fence. "Almost there. Stay with me." The current yanked at them, threatening to tear his grip away. Jaden's muscles screamed. The fence creaked ominously. A sound cut through the rain, an engine. Hope surged through him as a rescue boat appeared through the gloom, its spotlight sweeping the water. "Here!" Jaden shouted. "We're here!" The boat turned toward them, but the engine's roar was drowned out by an even louder sound, the crack of wood splitting. Through the rain, Jaden saw a massive section of dock break free from upstream. It tumbled through the water like an avalanche, heading straight for them. Time slowed. Jaden saw two choices with crystal clarity. Let go of Mrs. Thompson and swim to safety, or hold on and risk them both being crushed. Marcus's face flashed through his mind. Not the desperate, fearful expression from that last day, but his smile earlier that morning, full of life and trust. Jaden tightened his grip on Mrs. Thompson and kicked away from the fence with every ounce of strength he had left. They plunged back into deeper water as the dock pieces smashed into the fence behind them. The current caught them again, spinning them like leaves in a whirlwind. Jaden could no longer tell which way was up. His vision tunneled. Mrs. Thompson's weight seemed to double, then triple. Just before consciousness faded completely, he felt something solid bump against his back. Rough hands grabbed his shoulders, pulling them both up. "I've got them," a voice shouted. "Get us out of here." The rescue boat's engine roared. Rain pelted Jaden's face as he gulped air. Through half-closed eyes, he saw Mrs. Thompson being lifted onto the boat by firefighters in orange vests. "Let go, son," someone said gently. "You did it. Let us take it from here." But Jaden's muscles wouldn't unlock. He couldn't release his grip on Mrs. Thompson's blouse until they gave him oxygen, his body finally accepting that the nightmare was over. As they wrapped him in emergency blankets, Jaden heard his mother's voice from the shore. "That's my boy. My brave, stupid, wonderful boy." Mrs. Thompson stirred beside him on the boat, her hand finding his. "Thank you," she whispered. "Charles would have understood. About the watch." Jaden tried to answer, but exhaustion dragged him under. The last thing he saw was the rescue boat's spotlight illuminating his family on the shore, their faces a mixture of pride, relief, and lingering fear. The real challenge, he realized as consciousness faded, was only beginning. Chapter 4. Against the current, Jaden woke to the steady beep of hospital monitors and the smell of disinfectant. His throat felt raw, his muscles screaming with every small movement. Through half-open eyes, he saw his mother dozing in a plastic chair beside his bed. "Mom?" His voice came out as a croak. She jerked awake instantly. "Baby, how do you feel?" "Like I got hit by a truck." He tried to sit up, wincing. "Mrs. Thompson?" "Next door. She's doing fine, thanks to you." His mother's voice cracked. "Do you have any idea how close we came to losing you?" Before Jaden could answer, a nurse bustled in, followed by his father and Devin. The next hour was a blur of vital signs, doctor visits, and family hugs. His oxygen levels were good, they told him. No water in his lungs, just exhaustion and muscle strain. "You're trending on Twitter," Devin announced, holding up his phone. Someone filmed the whole thing. Jaden's stomach churned. "Turn it off." "But you're a hero. Look at all these comments." "I said turn it off." The heart monitor's beeping spiked with his voice. His father put a hand on Devin's shoulder. "Give your brother some space." A knock at the door interrupted them. A tall man in an expensive suit stood in the doorway, his gray hair perfectly styled. Something about his face looked familiar. "Mr. Thompson," Jaden's father said, standing. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "I caught the first flight from New York." Mr. Thompson's voice was deep, authoritative. "May I have a moment with the young man who saved my mother?" Jaden's parents exchanged glances, then filed out with Devin. Mr. Thompson took the chair by the bed, studying Jaden with intense blue eyes. "My mother told me what happened," he said finally. "How you didn't hesitate. How you kept her calm and conscious in the water. The rescue team said they've never seen anything like it." Jaden picked at his blanket. "Anyone would have helped?" "No, they wouldn't. I saw the video. Dozens of people stood on that shore, watching. Only you went in?" Mr. Thompson leaned forward. "Why?" The memory of Marcus hit Jaden like a physical blow. 3 years ago, my best friend drowned in that lake. I was there. I didn't know how to help him. So I taught myself everything I could about water rescue. Promised myself I'd never freeze like that again. Understanding flickered across Mr. Thompson's face. "The Johnson boy. I remember reading about that. Mother mentioned you practice swimming every morning." "Yes, sir. Even when some of our less welcoming residents tried to stop you?" Jaden met his eyes. "The lake belongs to everyone." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. "Yes. Yes, it does." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "My mother insisted I deliver this personally." Jaden's hands shook slightly as he opened it. Inside was a check with more zeros than he'd ever seen. "Sir, I can't. You can, and you will." Mr. Thompson's tone left no room for argument. "Mother was quite clear. She's been watching you for months, you know. Said you reminded her of my father when he was young. Same quiet determination. She's always been an excellent judge of character." Another knock interrupted them. A police officer entered, notebook in hand. "Sorry to interrupt, but we need a statement for the report. And there are news crews downstairs requesting interviews." Jaden's heart rate spiked again. The monitor's beeping grew faster. "No interviews," Mr. Thompson said firmly. "My lawyer will handle the media. The boy needs rest." But rest proved impossible. Throughout the day, a parade of visitors filed through. Doctors, nurses, police officers, well-wishers from the neighborhood. Each one wanted to hear the story. Each one called him a hero. Late that evening, after his family finally went home to shower and change, Jaden lay awake listening to the rain still falling outside. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications until he turned it off. A soft tap at his door made him tense. expecting another reporter who'd sneaked past security. But it was Mrs. Rodriguez, her weathered face lined with concern. "Just stopped by Mrs. Thompson's room," she said, settling into the chair. "She's doing well. Keeps telling everyone how you saved her life. I just did what needed doing." Mrs. Rodriguez snorted. "Just like your grandfather. He never took credit either." She patted his hand. "The storm's finally passing. But things are going to be different now. You know that, right?" Before Jaden could answer, shouting erupted in the hallway. He recognized Mr. Patterson's voice, the man who'd tried to chase him away from the lake that morning. "I demand to see him. That boy is a hero. I was wrong about him, so wrong." "Visiting hours are over, sir," a nurse responded firmly. "The neighborhood's taking up a collection," Mrs. Rodriguez continued as the voices faded. "For you and your family. And not just the old residents, the mansion folks too. Nothing like a near tragedy to bring people together." Jaden closed his eyes. "I don't want their money. Any of it. I just want things to go back to normal. Normal died in that lake today, child." She squeezed his hand. "The question is, what are you going to do with what comes next?" The door opened again. This time it was a doctor, followed by Mrs. Thompson in a wheelchair. Her silver hair was tied back simply, her hospital gown a far cry from her usual elegant clothes. But her spine was straight, her chin high. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "But I needed to see you." Mrs. Rodriguez stood. "I'll give you two a moment." Once they were alone, Mrs. Thompson wheeled closer to Jaden's bed. He could see bruises darkening on her arms where he'd gripped her in the water. "I've been thinking about what you said out there," she began. "About the package. Charles's watch." She twisted a ring on her finger. "I was so foolish, risking everything for a piece of metal. But grief makes us do strange things." "I understand," Jaden said quietly. "After Marcus died, I couldn't even look at the lake for months. Then one day I made myself get in. Been swimming every morning since. Yes, I've watched you. Such dedication." She met his eyes. "You know what my son offered you?" Jaden nodded. "Take it, please. Not because you expect a reward for doing the right thing. I can see in your face that's not who you are. Take it because it will help your family. Take it because it will let you help others." She smiled slightly. "I've already spoken to the community board. That lake safety program they've been blocking, it's happening now. And I want you involved." Thunder rumbled outside, softer now. The storm was moving on, but its effects would linger. In the lake's dark waters, pieces of docks still floated. Debris gathered against the shore, and nothing would ever be quite the same. "I'll think about it," Jaden said finally. Mrs. Thompson reached out, her cool hand covering his. "That's all I ask. For now." She wheeled back slightly. "Get some rest, dear. Tomorrow will be interesting." After she left, Jaden lay in the darkness, listening to the rain's gentle tapering and the steady beep of monitors. His phone sat silent on the bedside table, hundreds of notifications waiting. Somewhere in the hospital, reporters still lurked, eager for interviews. And in his mind, two scenes played on repeat. Marcus disappearing beneath dark water, and Mrs. Thompson's face when he'd reached her in the storm. One life he couldn't save, one he could. The difference lay in preparation, in refusing to let fear win, in doing what needed to be done, regardless of what anyone thought. Tomorrow would indeed be interesting. But tonight, finally, he slept. The hospital released Jaden the next morning. His muscles still ached with every movement, but the doctors said that was normal. "Just don't go swimming for at least a week," they warned. Camera flashes greeted him at the hospital entrance. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones thrust toward his face. "How does it feel to be a hero? Did you think about your own safety? What made you risk your life for Mrs. Thompson?" His father pushed through the crowd, leading Jaden to their car. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a brilliant blue sky that seemed to mock the destruction below. Streets remained flooded, debris scattered everywhere. "Your mother's at the house with the insurance adjusters," his father said as they drove. "Water got into the basement, but we're lucky compared to some." They passed Mrs. Rodriguez's cottage. The water line reached halfway up her front door. Volunteers in rubber boots carried waterlogged furniture to the curb. "Pull over," Jaden said suddenly. "Son, you need rest. Please, Dad." His father sighed but stopped the car. Jaden climbed out, his legs shaky. Mrs. Rodriguez spotted him from her porch. "Oh, no, you don't," she called. "Back in that car. You're in no shape to help." "But no buts. We got plenty of hands here." She gestured at the volunteers, a mix of old residents and mansion owners, working side by side. "Though I wouldn't say no to some lemonade later. Once you're stronger." Mr. Patterson emerged from the house, carrying a soaked photo album. The man who tried to chase Jaden from the lake just yesterday couldn't meet his eyes now. "Your father's right," Mrs. Rodriguez said more gently. "Go home. Rest. There'll be plenty of work left tomorrow." At home, insurance adjusters in suits picked through their waterlogged basement. Devin sat on the front steps, still glued to his phone. "You're viral," he announced as Jaden approached. "The video has millions of views. People want to interview you." "Ellen's people called." "I don't want to be interviewed." Jaden's voice came out sharper than intended. "I don't want to be viral. I just want—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. What did he want? For things to go back to normal? That seemed impossible now. His mother appeared in the doorway. "Baby, come inside. There's someone here to see you." Jaden's heart sank, expecting more reporters. Instead, he found Marcus's parents sitting in their living room. Mrs. Johnson's eyes were red, but she smiled when she saw him. "We had to come," she said, standing to hug him. "Had to see for ourselves that you're okay." Mr. Johnson cleared his throat. "That video, watching you go into that water." He wiped his eyes. "You did what none of us could do for Marcus. You saved her." "I'm sorry," Jaden whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't, don't." Mrs. Johnson's grip tightened. "Don't you dare apologize. You were just kids then. But look at what you did with that pain. Look at what you became." They talked for an hour. About Marcus. About the rescue. About the lake's safety program Mrs. Thompson wanted to start. When they left, Mrs. Johnson pressed something into Jaden's hand, a faded photograph of him and Marcus at the lake, grinning at the camera with fishing poles. "He'd be so proud of you," she said. "We all are." Later that afternoon, Mr. Thompson's lawyer arrived with papers. The check wasn't just a gift, he explained. They wanted to create a foundation, with Jaden's help, for lake safety education, swimming lessons, rescue training. "Mrs. Thompson is quite insistent," the lawyer said. "She wants you involved in every aspect. Of course, there would be compensation for your time." Jaden's father leaned forward. "How much compensation?" The number the lawyer named made them all sit back. "Take time to think it over," he said, standing. "But not too much time. The media attention won't last forever. We should strike while the story's hot." After he left, Jaden escaped to his room. The photo of him and Marcus stayed clutched in his hand. From his window, he could see the lake, its waters finally calm. Police boats patrolled, looking for damage, making sure no one had been missed in the evacuation. His phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Thompson. "Turn on Channel 5. He didn't want to, but curiosity won. The local news showed aerial footage of the rescue. Even from above, the violence of the water was clear. He watched himself dive in, watched the struggle to reach Mrs. Thompson, watched the massive dock section nearly crush them both. The remarkable rescue has sparked conversation about lake access and safety measures, the reporter said. Community leaders are already discussing changes. Jaden turned it off. His shoulders ached, his chest tight. The room felt too small suddenly. He needed air. Outside, the evening sun turned the flood waters golden. The air smelled of mud and wet wood. Neighbors waved as he walked past, calling out thanks, congratulations, offers of help if his family needed anything. His feet carried him to the lake's edge. Yellow caution tape blocked the usual access points. Signs warned of debris and contamination. But the water itself looked peaceful now, betraying no hint of yesterday's violence. "Thought I'd find you here." He turned to find Mrs. Thompson approaching slowly, leaning on a cane. Her son hovered nearby, ready to catch her if she stumbled. "Should you be out of the hospital?" Jaden asked. "Probably not, but I needed to see it." She gestured at the lake. "All my husband's hard work building that house. The dock he loved so much. All gone. I'm sorry." "Don't be. Things can be replaced." She touched his arm. "Lives can't." They stood in silence, watching the sunset paint the water orange and pink. Police boats headed in as darkness approached. Cleanup crews packed up for the day, leaving the debris for tomorrow. "Did my lawyer speak with you?" Mrs. Thompson asked finally. "Yes, about the foundation." And Jaden took a deep breath. "Why me? I'm just a kid who spends every morning training, who didn't hesitate when someone needed help, who looked past prejudice and feared to do what was right." Her voice strengthened. "Don't diminish what you did, Jaden. Own it. Use it. I don't know how." "Yes, you do." She smiled. "You've been teaching yourself for 3 years. Now you can teach others." A police officer approached, warning them away from the water's edge. As they turned to leave, Mrs. Thompson gripped Jaden's arm for support. "Think about what I said," she urged, "and come by tomorrow. I have something to show you." That night, Jaden dreamed of water. But for the first time in 3 years, he didn't wake in a cold sweat. The lake in his dreams was calm, welcoming, a place of possibility rather than fear. When morning came, he knew what he had to do. Jaden stood in front of Mrs. Thompson's damaged mansion, surprised to find renovation crews already at work. The front lawn was a maze of construction equipment, dumpsters overflowing with waterlogged furniture and broken pieces of dock. Mr. Thompson answered the door himself. Right on time, mother's in the study. He led Jaden through halls stripped of wet drywall, past workers in dust masks carrying out moldy carpeting. The study, on the second floor, had escaped the worst of the flooding. Mrs. Thompson sat at a massive desk, surrounded by papers. "Ah, there you are." She waved Jaden to a chair. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Still sore." "Yes, well, near-death experiences tend to leave a mark." She shuffled through papers until she found what she wanted. "Here, take a look at these." Jaden accepted the stack. Architectural drawings, permit applications, budget proposals. All for something called the Thompson-Williams Lake Safety Center. "Williams," he asked. "Your name belongs on it too." Mrs. Thompson leaned forward. "The foundation will fund it, but we need someone to run the program, someone who understands both the technical aspects and the community. I'm 15, 16 next month, old enough to start training, learning the business side. By the time you finish high school, you'll be ready to take over completely." A knock interrupted them. Mr. Patterson stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. "Sorry to interrupt, but the insurance adjuster needs signatures." He trailed off, seeing Jaden. "Come in, Richard," Mrs. Thompson said. "Actually, your timing is perfect. Tell Jaden what you told the community board this morning." Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. "Yes, well, we've unanimously approved the safety center proposal." And he met Jaden's eyes. "I personally apologize for my previous behavior. I let prejudice cloud my judgment. Actions matter more than words," Jaden said quietly. Yes, they do." Mr. Patterson straightened. "That's why I'm donating part of my lakefront property for the center. Best access point, high ground. It's the least I can do." After he left, Mrs. Thompson smiled. "Amazing how near tragedy changes perspective, isn't it?" "Why are you doing all this?" Jaden asked. "The money, the foundation, this center, it's too much." "Is it?" She stood slowly, walking to the window. Below, workers cleared debris from what remained of her dock. "You know what I thought about in that water? Not my house, not Charles's watch. I thought about all the times I watched you swimming, training, preparing. All the times I heard others complain about you using their lake. And I did nothing." She turned back to him. "I'm wealthy, Jaden. Wealthy enough that I could have built a safety center years ago. Could have sponsored swimming lessons, hired lifeguards, done something after that poor Johnson boy died. But I didn't. I sat in my big house and watched. That wasn't your responsibility." "No, we're all responsible for our community. For each other." She tapped the papers in his hands. "This isn't charity. It's investment in what matters. In people like you who act when others just watch." Jaden studied the plans. The proposed center was beautiful, modern, accessible, with classroom space and rescue equipment. A place that could actually make a difference. "I don't know anything about running something like this," he admitted. "You'll learn. We'll hire experts to teach you. Start small, swimming lessons for kids, water safety classes. Build from there." She smiled. "Unless you had other plans for the next few years?" Before Jaden could answer, his phone buzzed. A text from Devin. CNN wants to interview you live tomorrow. Mrs. Thompson noticed his expression. Yes, the media circus. That's the other thing we need to discuss. How to handle your sudden fame. I don't want fame. No, but you have it. The question is how to use it. She returned to her desk. The foundation needs publicity to succeed. Your story. A young black man risking his life to save someone who represented the very people who tried to exclude him. It resonates. Especially now. Jaden shifted uncomfortably. That's not why I did it. Of course not. That's exactly why it matters. She pressed a button on her desk phone. Send them in? The door opened. Marcus's parents entered, followed by Mrs. Rodriguez and several other longtime residents. What's going on? Jaden asked. Show him, Mrs. Thompson told the group. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, holding a thick folder. Signatures from every family in the old neighborhood, all supporting you as director of the new center. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke next. We trust you, child. You understand both sides of the lake. Both sides of life here. Jaden's throat tightened as he looked through the signatures. Names he'd known all his life. People who'd watched him grow up, who'd mourned with him when Marcus died. The mansion owners signed too, Mr. Thompson added from the doorway. Every one of them. Mother can be very persuasive. So? Mrs. Thompson watched him carefully. What do you say? Jaden looked down at the plans again. The center could do so much good, could prevent another tragedy like Marcus, could bridge the divide in their community. But it would mean stepping into the spotlight, dealing with media, with expectations, with responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for. As if reading his thoughts, Mrs. Johnson touched his shoulder. Marcus would be first in line to take lessons from you. You know that, right? Something settled in Jaden's chest, a certainty he hadn't felt since before his friend died. Okay, he said, I'll do it, but I have conditions. Mrs. Thompson's eyes sparkled. Name them. The lessons have to be free for local kids. All of them, already in the budget, and I want to start right away. No waiting for the building. We can use the community center pool until it's ready. Done? And Jaden took a deep breath. I want to do one interview. Just one. To announce the center and what we're trying to do. Then the media leaves me alone to actually do the work. Mrs. Thompson grinned. I knew I saved the right young man. Everyone laughed, the tension breaking. As they discussed details, Jaden felt something he hadn't expected: excitement. The lake had taken his best friend, had nearly taken Mrs. Thompson, but now it could give something back, could become what it was always meant to be, a place that brought people together instead of dividing them. Later, walking home past cleanup crews and rebuilding neighbors, Jaden stopped at the water's edge. The late afternoon sun sparkled on the surface, peaceful again after the storm's fury. Tomorrow would bring challenges, interviews, responsibilities, expectations. But for now, he simply stood and watched the lake, no longer afraid of its depths. He had survived them, had helped someone else survive them, and in doing so, had found a way to make Marcus's death mean something more than loss. The water lapped gently at his feet, and for the first time in 3 years, Jaden smiled at its touch. The community center's indoor pool smelled of chlorine and echoed with splashing. Jaden stood at the edge, watching a dozen kids practice floating. Most were from his neighborhood, children who'd grown up afraid of the lake that dominated their community. Remember, he called out, keep your chin tucked, belly up. The water wants to hold you. You're a natural teacher, Mrs. Thompson said from her chair nearby. She came to every session, taking notes, offering suggestions. Her cane leaned against the wall, rarely used now. A small boy struggled, panic crossing his face as he started to sink. Jaden was in the water, instantly supporting him. I got you, Marcus Jr. The name still caught in his throat sometimes. Just like we practiced. Deep breath. Feel the water. Marcus's little brother relaxed, spreading his arms. I'm doing it. Yeah, you are? Jaden slowly removed his hands. All by yourself now. The boy floated independently for 10 seconds before excitement made him lose form. He came up grinning, water streaming down his face. Mom, did you see? Mrs. Johnson waved from the observation area. Other parents sat with her, watching their children conquer their fears one lesson at a time. The interview had aired last week, Jaden and Mrs. Thompson announcing the safety center together. They kept it focused on the future, on prevention and community healing. The media attention had brought donations pouring in, accelerating their timeline. Construction starts next month, Mrs. Thompson said as the kids climbed out for a break. Ahead of schedule. Good. This pool's already too small. Jaden grabbed a towel. We had to turn people away again today. Patience. Rome wasn't built in a day. Rome didn't have a waiting list of 50 kids. She smiled at his frustration. No, but it had something equally valuable, momentum. Look around. Jaden did. Parents who'd barely spoken to each other a month ago now chatted easily. Kids from both sides of the lake played together during breaks. Even Mr. Patterson had started volunteering, handling paperwork and scheduling. Change takes time, Mrs. Thompson continued. But it's happening. Every ripple spreads. Speaking of ripples, Jaden lowered his voice. Did you talk to the board about my idea? The scholarship program? Yes. They're interested, but concerned about funding. Show them this. He pulled out his phone, opening an email. The American Red Cross wants to partner with us. They'll certify our advanced students as lifeguards, help with job placement. Mrs. Thompson read quickly, her eyebrows rising. This is significant. Kids who complete the program can work summers at pools, beaches, water parks. Real jobs, good pay. Jaden watched Marcus Jr. splash with his friends. Some of these families, that extra income could change everything. You've thought this through? I had a good teacher. He smiled. You weren't just teaching me about running a foundation, were you? Let's just say I recognized potential when I saw it. She tucked her phone away. The board meets Thursday. Have a formal proposal ready. The afternoon session focused on older kids, teenagers like Jaden. Many were already strong swimmers, wanting rescue certification. He worked them harder, drilling safety procedures and emergency responses. Again, he called as they practiced partner carries. In real conditions, your victim will panic. They'll fight you. You have to be stronger than their fear. Like you were, someone asked. Jaden turned. A girl he didn't recognize stood at the pool's edge, maybe 17, dark hair dripping on her t-shirt. You're not registered for this class, he said. No, I'm from the Houston Chronicle. She held up a notebook. Student journalist. Doing a follow-up story on the rescue. No interviews. That was the deal. Just one question? She stepped closer. How did it feel, knowing you might die trying to save someone who represented everything wrong with gentrification in your neighborhood? The pool went quiet. Even the splashing stopped. Wrong? Jaden met her eyes. Mrs. Thompson needed help. Nothing else mattered. But surely you felt some satisfaction? Proving them wrong about you. You don't understand anything. He turned away. Class dismissed. Good work today, everyone? The journalist tried to ask more questions, but the students formed a barrier between them, giving Jaden time to escape to the office. He sat heavily in his chair, hands shaking slightly. A knock at the door. Mrs. Thompson entered without waiting for response. I heard, she said. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this. How? I'm still figuring it out myself. Jaden rubbed his face. Everyone wants to make it about race, about class, about everything except what actually happened. And what had happened? You know what happened. You were there. Tell me anyway. Jaden sighed. I saw someone who needed help. Someone's mother, someone's friend. The water doesn't care who you are or what you own. Neither did I. And that, Mrs. Thompson said softly, is exactly what you should have told that young reporter. He looked up. What? Your story matters, Jaden. Not because of race or class, but because of its humanity. Its simplicity. She sat across from him. You saw past all the artificial divisions we create and did what needed doing. That's the message people need to hear. I don't want to be a message. Too late. She smiled. But you can choose what that message is. Before Jaden could respond, commotion erupted in the pool area. They hurried out to find Marcus Jr. performing a perfect rescue of a practice dummy, his small face set with concentration. Look, he called to Jaden. I remembered everything you showed us. The other kids cheered as he towed the dummy to safety. Mrs. Johnson wiped tears from her eyes. See? Mrs. Thompson murmured. Some messages write themselves. That evening, Jaden sat by the lake, watching the sunset paint the water gold. Construction equipment stood ready at the safety center site, waiting to break ground. Soon the landscape would change again, but this time for the better. His phone buzzed, a text from the student journalist. "I'm sorry. You were right. I missed the real story. Would you consider letting me write about the safety center instead? The actual work you're doing?" Jaden thought about Mrs. Thompson's words, about messages and meanings, about ripples spreading outward. "Come to tomorrow's beginners class," he wrote back. "See for yourself what we're building. No interviews. Just watch." The reply came quickly. "Thank you. I will." The lake lapped at the shore, peaceful in the fading light. Somewhere out there, Marcus's spirit lingered. But now it felt less like a haunting and more like a guide, showing Jaden where his path led next. He had work to do. The Foundation's conference room buzzed with nervous energy. Jaden adjusted his tie, his first one, bought specially for this meeting. Around the table sat the board members, business leaders, community representatives, and Mrs. Thompson at the head, looking regal despite the early hour. "The floor is yours," she said, nodding to Jaden. He stood, passing out folders. 3 months ago, we started swimming lessons at the community pool. Today, I want to show you what those lessons have become. The presentation screen lit up with photos. Kids learning water safety, teenagers practicing rescue techniques, families from both sides of the lake working together. "We've certified 30 students in basic water safety," Jaden continued. 15 are advancing to lifeguard training. But more importantly, he clicked to the next slide. "We've erased our waiting list." Mr. Patterson leaned forward. "How?" "Last month you had 50 kids waiting. By training our advanced students to help teach beginners. It creates a pipeline, learn, then lead." Jaden changed slides again. "And now we need to expand." The room stilled. This was the moment Mrs. Thompson had warned him about, when vision met reality. "The safety center breaks ground next week," Jaden said. "But it's not just about swimming anymore. Look at these numbers." Charts appeared on screen: household incomes, employment rates, community statistics. Most of our advanced students come from families making less than $30,000 a year. They can't afford summer camps or private lessons. But with certification, he highlighted a figure. They can earn $20 an hour as lifeguards. More at water parks. One board member frowned. "We're not a job training program." "No." Jaden met his eyes. "We're better. We're creating leaders. Kids who save lives and teach others to do the same." He clicked again. New photos appeared, his students volunteering at elementary schools, teaching water safety basics. They're already changing things. Last month, Marcus Jr., one of our youngest students, showed his first grade class how to recognize someone drowning. 2 days later, one of those first graders spotted her baby brother in trouble at a pool party and called for help. Mrs. Thompson smiled slightly. "Go on. I'm proposing we establish a scholarship fund for students who complete our advanced program and commit to teaching beginners." Jaden distributed more papers. "The Red Cross will certify them. Local pools and parks will hire them, and their younger siblings get priority enrollment in our classes." "Creating a cycle," Mrs. Thompson added. "Each family lifting the next." Questions flew. Costs? Logistics? Liability? Jaden had answers ready. He'd spent weeks preparing. Mrs. Thompson watched proudly as he handled each concern. Finally, the board voted. Unanimous approval. Outside afterward, Mrs. Thompson squeezed his arm. "Excellent work. Though I'm curious, you didn't mention the biggest news." It wasn't relevant to the proposal. The governor's office calling to commend our program isn't relevant? Jaden shrugged. "That's politics. I care about the work." She laughed. "Just like your grandfather. He never cared for recognition either." They walked toward the construction site. The safety center's foundation was already laid, concrete spreading out like a promise kept. Workers nodded as they passed. Many were local, hired specifically for this project. Another ripple effect Jaden hadn't anticipated. "Mrs. Johnson called this morning," Mrs. Thompson said. "She wants to donate Marcus's swimming trophies for display in the center's lobby." Jaden stopped walking. "Really?" "She says it's time they inspired others instead of gathering dust." She watched his face. "Are you ready for next week?" The groundbreaking ceremony. Press would attend. city officials, hundreds of community members. "I have to be," he said. No speeches this time, just a simple dedication. They reached the construction fence. Beyond it, the lake sparkled in morning sun. Strange to think that just 3 months ago, those same waters had nearly killed them both. "I've been thinking," Jaden said slowly, "about the center's name. Oh, Thompson Williams doesn't feel right anymore. It's bigger than us now." She nodded. "What do you suggest?" "The Marcus Johnson Memorial Safety Center." Jaden turned to her. "He's the reason any of this exists. My training, the rescue, everything. The board will approve it." She smiled. "I'll make sure of that." Muma caught their eye. A group of Jaden's students had arrived early for their lesson, gathering at the community pool. Among them stood the student journalist, notebook tucked away, helping Marcus Jr. adjust his goggles. "Your article came out well," Mrs. Thompson commented. "She got it right," Jaden agreed. "Focused on the kids, the community, the future." Speaking of the future, she pulled an envelope from her bag. "The contractor's latest timeline. We'll need to coordinate the move from the community pool." Jaden studied the papers. His students' voices carried across the morning air, excited and eager to begin. Soon they'd have a real facility, professional equipment, everything they needed to grow the program. "One step at a time," he said, echoing her words from months ago. "Indeed." She took his arm. "Shall we? Those kids won't teach themselves." They walked together toward the pool, toward the sounds of splashing and laughter, toward a future neither had imagined before the flood. Behind them, construction crews began another day's work, building something new from the aftermath of disaster. The lake watched it all, its surface calm and bright, offering no hint of its power to destroy or its power to unite. But Jaden knew both sides now, understood both respect and possibility. He had a legacy to build. 1 year to the day after the flood, Jaden stood before the Marcus Johnson Memorial Safety Center. The morning sun gleamed off its windows, reflecting the lake beyond. A crowd gathered on the fresh lawn. Students, families, reporters, officials. "Ready?" Mrs. Thompson asked beside him. Jaden touched the ribbon stretched across the entrance. Red, like the lifeguard suits his advanced students now wore. "Almost doesn't feel real," he said. "Oh, it's real." She gestured at his students, lined up in their new uniforms. "They're real. This is real." Marcus Jr. bounced on his toes in the front row, barely containing his excitement. Behind him stood the first graduating class of certified lifeguards, including the student journalist who'd once questioned Jaden's motives. Now she wore a red suit like the others, her reporter's notebook replaced by rescue equipment. Mayor Chin approached the podium. 1 year ago, our community faced a devastating flood. But from those waters rose something extraordinary. Jaden only half listened to the speech. His attention caught on familiar faces in the crowd. Mrs. Rodriguez, recovered from her flood damage, beaming with pride. Mr. Patterson, who'd become one of their strongest supporters. His parents and Devin, recording everything on their phones. The Johnsons stood near the front, holding hands. Marcus's swimming trophies gleamed in a lobby display case behind them. And now, Mayor Chin concluded, "I invite Jaden Williams and Mrs. Eleanor Thompson to cut the ribbon and officially open this remarkable facility." They stepped forward together, scissors ready. Cameras flashed. "Would you like to say something first?" the mayor asked. Jaden hadn't planned to speak. But looking at his students, at the community gathered together, words came. "A year ago, someone asked me why I risked my life to save Mrs. Thompson. They thought it was about proving something." He met the student journalist's eyes. She smiled, nodding encouragement. "But it wasn't about proving anything. It was about what my best friend Marcus taught me. That the water doesn't care who you are. Rich or poor, black or white, it can take anyone." Jaden gestured at the center. "So we built this place to teach everyone how to respect the water, how to help each other, how to turn fear into strength." Mrs. Thompson squeezed his arm. "Together," she added. The scissors flashed. The ribbon fell. Applause erupted as the doors swung open. Inside, the center exceeded even Jaden's hopes. A state-of-the-art pool filled the main space, with classroom areas and training rooms branching off. The lobby featured a wall of heroes, Photos of local lifeguards and rescue workers, with Marcus's picture in the center. Students and families poured in, exclaiming over the facilities. Jaden's advanced class immediately began demonstrating rescue techniques in the pool, showing off their skills for the cameras. "Mr. Williams," Marcus Jr. called from the water. "Watch this." He executed a perfect rescue entry, just like they practiced. His mother wiped tears from her eyes. "He's ready," Mrs. Johnson said quietly to Jaden. "For the junior instructor program." "Been ready," Jaden agreed. "He's got his brother's talent." The day passed in a blur of tours, demonstrations, and congratulations. By late afternoon, most of the crowd had gone. Jaden sat at the pool's edge, feet dangling in the water. Mrs. Thompson found him there. "Penny for your thoughts?" "Just thinking about that day." "The flood." He looked up at her. "Did you ever get the watch?" "Charles's watch." She smiled. "No, but I got something better." She sat beside him, rolling up her pants to put her feet in the water. "I got perspective, understanding of what really matters." "And what's that?" "The future." She nodded toward the pool, where the last few students still practiced. "What we leave behind." Movement at the door caught their attention. A group of new families entered, looking uncertain. "First evening session," Jaden said, standing. "Beginning adult classes." Mrs. Thompson grinned. "Finally going to teach me to swim properly? About time, don't you think?" They walked to greet the newcomers. Through the windows, the lake glittered in sunset light. Its waters looked peaceful, but Jaden knew better now. Knew its power and its beauty, its danger and its gifts. "Welcome," he told the new students. "Ready to get started?" Their faces showed familiar emotions: fear, hope, determination. The same feelings he'd seen in his own reflection for 3 years after Marcus died. But now he could offer what he'd never had: proper training, support, community. First rule, he began, just as he had a year ago in the community pool. The water wants to hold you. You just have to trust it, and trust yourself. As his voice echoed off the center's walls, Jaden felt pieces clicking into place. This was his legacy, not the rescue that made him famous, but what he chose to build afterward. Every student who conquered their fear, every family that grew stronger, every barrier that broke down, added another ripple to the change that started in that storm. The lake had taken his best friend, had nearly taken Mrs. Thompson, had threatened to divide their community. But in the end, it had also given them a chance to rebuild something better. "Together. Let's begin," Jaden said, leading his new students toward the water. Behind him, Mrs. Thompson watched proudly. Around him, the center hummed with activity and purpose. And beyond the windows, the lake waited, no longer an enemy to be feared, but a teacher to be respected. 1 year had changed everything, but Jaden knew this was just the beginning. He had a legacy to protect, a future to build, and every splash, every smile, every small victory in that pool brought both a little closer to reality. The water didn't care who you were or where you came from, but what you chose to do with it, that made all the difference. Jaden dove in, ready to show another group of students the way forward, ready to keep the ripples spreading outward, touching lives he'd never even imagined when he first started swimming at dawn in a divided lake. This was his purpose now, his gift to give back. And somewhere, he knew, Marcus was smiling.